Mao Zedong, A Life of Triumph and Tragedy in Modern China. Part 1. The Early Years of Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong, later revered or reviled as Chairman Mao, was born on December 26, 1893, in the rural village of Shaoshan in Jiangtan County, nestled in the southern province of Hunan, China. This modest village, surrounded by lush green hills and far removed from the bustling political centers of China, was where Mao's story began, a story that would transform not only his own destiny, but the trajectory of an entire nation. The environment of Shaoshan was emblematic of rural China at the time, marked by agricultural rhythms, deeply rooted Confucian traditions, and the simplicity of a peasant life. Mao's father, Mao Yicheng, came from a lineage of struggling peasants who had toiled under the weight of poverty for generations. Yicheng's own life reflected the grit and resourcefulness required to escape such dire circumstances. In his youth, he served as a soldier in the Xiang Army, a military force that was instrumental in defending Hunan during periods of unrest. After leaving military service, Yicheng returned to Shaoshan with a determination to improve his station in life. He invested his savings into farming, and through sheer hard work, coupled with a shrewd sense for business, he managed to acquire enough wealth to lend money to others in the district. This dual role as a farmer and a lender made him one of the more prosperous individuals in Shaoshan, with ownership of about 20 acres of farmland, an impressive accomplishment in an agrarian society where land ownership signified wealth and status. Mao's mother, Wen Shimi, in contrast to her husband's stern and pragmatic disposition, was a gentle and devout Buddhist. Her life, however, was marked by hardship. She had endured a troubled upbringing as the daughter of a poor shoemaker who succumbed to heavy drinking. Her mother, in a less than ideal societal arrangement, had been her father's concubine. Despite these challenges, Wen Shimei carried a quiet resilience and compassion that left an indelible impression on her children, especially Mao. She provided a counterbalance to the authoritarian rule of her husband, tempering the harshness of Yicheng's discipline whenever she could. Mao's childhood was far from idyllic, as his father's strict and often punitive parenting style cast a shadow over his early years. Yicheng was known for his temper and rigid expectations, and he didn't hesitate to discipline Mao and his siblings through corporal punishment whenever they disobeyed or failed to meet his high standards. Such discipline was typical in traditional Chinese families at the time, where filial piety and respect for authority were paramount. Despite her best efforts, Wen Shimei's attempts to shield her children from their father's wrath were largely ineffective. Mao, the eldest surviving son, bore the brunt of his father's ambitions and frustrations. Yet amidst this difficult familial environment, young Mao exhibited a curiosity and rebellious spirit that set him apart. As a child, he briefly followed in his mother's Buddhist faith, participating in her rituals and prayers. However, this interest in religion waned as he grew older and began to question the world around him. By the time he was 8 years old, as the 20th century dawned, Mao was enrolled in a local primary school in Shaoshan. This marked the beginning of his formal education, an endeavor that would open his mind to the vast world beyond his rural upbringing. The curriculum at Mao's school reflected a blend of traditional Chinese education and the influences of a rapidly changing global context. Rooted in Confucian principles, students were taught classical Chinese texts that emphasized moral conduct, social hierarchy, and the importance of harmony within the family and society. However, as the currents of modernization reached even the remote corners of China, elements of Western education began to seep into the curriculum. Ideas of science, technology, and politics, hallmarks of the industrialized Western world, offered a stark contrast to the centuries-old traditions of the East. For the young Mao, this duality of influences would play a significant role in shaping his worldview. Even as a boy, Mao displayed an early interest in history and politics, subjects that would later dominate his life. This intellectual curiosity, coupled with his natural independence and defiance of authority, often put him at odds with his father. The friction between them came to a head when Mao was just 13 years old. At this young age, Yicheng arranged for Mao to marry Luo Yishu, the 17-year-old daughter of a wealthy local farmer. Such arranged marriages were common in rural China and were often seen as strategic alliances to consolidate wealth and social standing. However, Mao's response was anything but typical. He vehemently refused to honor the arrangement, defying not only his father's wishes, but also the societal norms of the time. Mao's refusal to marry Luo Yishu caused a stir in the Shaoshan community, where filial obedience was considered a cornerstone of family life. His rebellion against this tradition was a bold and controversial act, signaling the emergence of his independent spirit and willingness to challenge established norms. Fallout from this disagreement led to a temporary estrangement between Mao and his father. Mao left his family's farm in protest, seeking refuge elsewhere. Although he returned to Shaoshan after some time, the incident underscored a recurring theme in his life: a deep-seated resistance to authority and a drive to carve his own path. As Mao grew older, he found himself coming of age during a period of immense upheaval and transformation in China. The turn of the century marked the waning years of the Qing dynasty, an imperial rule that had lasted for nearly 300 years, but was now crumbling under the pressures of internal corruption, social unrest, and external threats. The once mighty empire, which had maintained a rigidly hierarchical and conservative society for centuries, was being forced to confront the encroachment of Western powers armed with modern technology, advanced weaponry, and new political ideologies. This was the world into which Mao Zedong was born, a world where tradition clashed with change, and where the seeds of revolution were beginning to take root. But the turbulence of the times and the unique circumstances of his upbringing were already shaping the man who would one day become one of the most pivotal figures in modern Chinese history. Part 2. A youth shaped by political awakening and education. As Mao Zedong entered his teenage years, the currents of change sweeping through China began to leave an indelible mark on his life. The final years of the Qing dynasty were marked by growing unrest, widespread dissatisfaction, and a national yearning for reform. While Mao was still rooted in the rural simplicity of Shaoshan, his exposure to education and emerging political ideas started to expand his horizons and set the stage for his later ideological awakening. When Mao turned 13, the rigidity of his father's authority became increasingly stifling. His rebellious nature had already been evident in his refusal to submit to an arranged marriage, but this defiance was not limited to familial expectations. Mao began to crave intellectual stimulation beyond the confines of his rural environment. His interest in history and politics deepened, and he began reading voraciously about China's past and the global forces shaping the present. In 1906, Mao's father, who valued practical skills over intellectual pursuits, became frustrated with Mao's desire to continue his education. This marked a significant turning point in his life, as it exposed him to a broader range of ideas and influences. The school in Changsheng offered a curriculum that balanced classical Chinese teachings with modern subjects, including mathematics, geography, and political science, subjects that opened Mao's mind to new possibilities for China's future. During this period, Mao became acutely aware of the challenges facing China. The Qing dynasty's hold on power was faltering as the nation faced internal rebellions, foreign domination, and widespread poverty. Western powers had begun exerting significant influence over China's economy and politics, often through unequal treaties that stripped the nation of its sovereignty. Mao's generation, witnessing these humiliations, grew restless and increasingly dissatisfied with the traditional systems that had long governed Chinese society. The seeds of revolutionary thought were taking root in Mao's mind as he grappled with the question of how to transform a nation that seemed trapped in a cycle of decline. In 1911, when Mao was just 17 years old, China underwent a seismic political shift. The collapse of the Qing dynasty and the establishment of the Republic of China marked the end of over 2 millennia of imperial rule. The revolution was spearheaded by figures like Sun Yat-sen, whose vision of a republican government resonated with young intellectuals across the nation. For Mao, these events were electrifying. The traditional Confucian values that had shaped Chinese society for centuries were being challenged, and new political ideologies, including democracy and socialism, began to gain traction. Amid this atmosphere of political upheaval, Mao's education continued to play a crucial role in shaping his outlook. In 1911, he moved to Changsha, the capital of Hunan Province, to attend a middle school. Changsha was a bustling city compared to Shaoshan, and it provided Mao with his first exposure to a more urban and politically vibrant environment. It was here that he encountered a wider array of political ideas, including the writings of Sun Yat-sen, whose call for a republican government inspired Mao's early political thinking. Mao also began reading about Western political systems, including those of the United States and Europe, where democratic institutions had taken root. Mao's time in Changsha coincided with the outbreak of the Xinhai Revolution in October 1911, which ultimately led to the abdication of the last Qing emperor, the 6-year-old Puyi, in February 1912. The revolution was a defining moment in Chinese history, and Mao was eager to be part of it. Enthralled by the call for change, he briefly joined a local militia aligned with the revolutionary forces. This was Mao's first foray into political activism, albeit a short-lived one. After a few months, he returned to his studies, but the experience left a lasting impression on him. The collapse of the Qing dynasty and the establishment of the Republic of China were proof that entrenched systems of power could be overthrown, a lesson that would deeply influence Mao's revolutionary ideology in later years. As the political landscape of China evolved, Mao's intellectual journey continued. He began to read widely, immersing himself in the works of Western philosophers and political theorists. The ideas of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Montesquieu, and Adam Smith introduced him to concepts of liberty, equality, and economic reform, while Chinese reformist thinkers like Kang Youwei and Liang Qichao offered visions of modernization and national renewal. These diverse influences began to shape Mao's understanding of governance and social justice, laying the groundwork for his eventual embrace of Marxist ideology. In 1913, Mao made a pivotal decision to pursue a career in education. Recognizing the transformative power of knowledge, he enrolled at the First Normal School of Hunan, widely regarded as the province's premier institution for teacher training. The school was not only an academic hub, but also a breeding ground for radical political thought. It was here that Mao began to refine his intellectual abilities and develop the leadership skills that would later define his political career. His dedication to his studies earned him the respect of his peers, and he quickly rose to prominence within the student body. Mao's time at the First Normal School marked the beginning of his transition from a curious student to an emerging political thinker. He immersed himself in the study of Chinese history, Western political philosophy, and modern scientific theories. His intellectual growth was paralleled by his involvement in student organizations, where he demonstrated a talent for leadership and persuasion. As secretary of the Student Society, Mao organized debates and discussions on topics ranging from social reform to China's place in the world. These experiences not only honed his oratorical skills, but also deepened his understanding of the challenges facing his country. By the time Mao graduated in 1918, he was a transformed individual. The shy and rebellious boy from Shaoshan had grown into a confident and ambitious young man with a clear sense of purpose. His experiences in Changsha, combined with his exposure to revolutionary ideas and his rigorous education, had ignited a passion for political change. While he was not yet a committed Marxist, Mao's interest in socialism and communism had begun to take shape. He viewed these ideologies as potential solutions to the deep inequalities and systemic injustices that plagued China. As Mao prepared to leave the relative safety of academia and step into the wider world, he carried with him a vision for a better future, a vision that would soon collide with the tumultuous realities of early 20th century China. The next chapter of his life would see him move to Peking, now Beijing, where his political awakening would reach new heights and the seeds of his revolutionary career would fully germinate. Part 3. The Peking Years and Mao's Political Awakening. In 1917, shortly before his graduation from the First Normal School of Hunan, Mao Zedong experienced a significant shift in his ambitions. Having initially considered a career in education, his growing exposure to radical ideas and dissatisfaction with China's political stagnation pushed him toward a life of activism. By 1918, he decided to leave Hunan and head to Peking, modern-day Beijing, the capital of China and a city steeped in political and cultural ferment. This decision marked the beginning of a transformative period in Mao's life, as he entered an environment that would fully awaken his political consciousness. Mao's arrival in Peking coincided with a time of profound uncertainty and change in China. Although the Qing dynasty had been overthrown in 1912, the fledgling Republic of China was struggling to assert its authority. The country was plagued by internal divisions, warlordism, and the lingering influence of foreign powers. Peking, as the seat of the Republican government, was a hub of intellectual activity, attracting reformers, revolutionaries, and scholars from across the nation. For the young Mao, who was eager to engage with new ideas, this was an environment ripe with opportunity. Upon reaching Peking, Mao secured a position as an assistant in the library of Peking University, thanks to the support of Yang Changji, one of his former teachers from the First Normal School of Hunan. Yang, who had taken a faculty position at the university, saw potential in Mao and encouraged him to continue his education in informal ways. While his job at the library was menial, consisting mostly of organizing books and performing administrative tasks, it offered Mao invaluable access to a treasure trove of knowledge. The university's library housed works by Western philosophers, political theorists, and social reformers, as well as translations of Marxist texts, all of which Mao eagerly devoured. Working in the library also brought Mao into contact with some of the most prominent intellectuals of the time, including the university's chancellor, Cai Yuanpei, and its chief librarian, Li Dezhao. Li, in particular, became a crucial influence on Mao's political development. A committed Marxist, Li had been inspired by the Russian Revolution of 1917 and was one of the earliest proponents of communism in China. Through conversations with Li and exposure to his writings, Mao began to explore Marxism more seriously. Mao's time at Peking University was not only a period of intellectual growth, but also one of social awakening. Despite his growing enthusiasm for radical ideas, Mao struggled to fit into the university's elite circles. As a young man from a rural background, he felt out of place among the cosmopolitan and often Western-educated students and faculty. This sense of alienation was compounded by the attitudes of many of Peking's upper and middle classes, who looked down on individuals from rural provinces like Hunan. Mao's experiences of exclusion deepened his understanding of class divisions and reinforced his sympathy for the plight of China's peasants and workers. In addition to his work at the library, Mao began engaging with political activism during his time in Peking. He joined several student organizations and participated in discussions about China's future. These groups, often informal gatherings of young intellectuals, debated a wide range of topics from the merits of socialism to the failures of the Republican government. Mao's natural charisma and ability to articulate his views made him an increasingly influential figure within these circles, even as he continued to grapple with his identity and role in the larger revolutionary movement. The pivotal moment of this period came in 1919 with the May 4th movement, a watershed event in modern Chinese history. The movement was sparked by widespread outrage over the Treaty of Versailles, which had awarded the German-controlled territory of Shandong in China to Japan rather than returning it to Chinese sovereignty. For many Chinese people, this decision symbolized the weakness of the Republican government and the ongoing humiliation of foreign domination. On May 4, 1919, thousands of students in Peking took to the streets in protest, demanding stronger resistance to foreign encroachments and advocating for political and cultural reform. Mao was deeply inspired by the May 4th protests. Although he did not participate directly in the demonstrations in Peking, he closely followed the events and became involved in organizing related activities in Hunan. It also reinforced his belief that change could only come through the mobilization of the masses, a principle that would become central to his revolutionary strategy in later years. In the months following the May 4th movement, Mao became increasingly committed to the idea of socialism as a solution to China's problems. His writings from this period reflect a growing admiration for the achievements of the Russian Bolsheviks, who had successfully overthrown the Tsarist regime and established a communist state. Mao began to see Marxism not merely as an abstract theory, but as a practical framework for addressing the deep inequalities and injustices in Chinese society. By 1920, Mao's political activities had expanded significantly. He played a key role in organizing student and worker groups in Hunan, advocating for labor rights and social reforms. His ability to connect with ordinary people and articulate their grievances set him apart from many of his contemporaries, who often focused on intellectual debates rather than grassroots organizing. Mao's approach reflected his growing belief that the peasantry, rather than the urban proletariat, would be the driving force behind China's revolution, a belief that would later become a defining feature of his Marxist ideology. As Mao's reputation as an organizer grew, so too did his sense of purpose. By the time he returned to Changsha in 1920, he had fully embraced the idea of revolution as the only means of achieving meaningful change in China. His journey from the quiet village of Shaoshan to the vibrant intellectual landscape of Peking had profoundly shaped his worldview, transforming him from a curious student into an emerging political leader. The lessons he learned during this period about the power of ideas, the importance of mass mobilization, and the necessity of challenging entrenched systems of power would guide him as he began to take his first steps toward building a revolutionary movement. Part 4. Mao's return to Hunan and the path to communism. By 1920, Mao Zedong had returned to his home province of Hunan, bringing with him the ideological fervor he had cultivated during his time in Peking. The lessons he had absorbed from Marxist texts, the influence of revolutionary thinkers like Li Dezhou, and the political energy of the May 4th movement were now channeled into a more localized effort to organize and mobilize the people of Hunan. This period was marked by Mao's transformation from a student and political observer to an active revolutionary, deeply engaged in grassroots efforts to address the inequalities and struggles of China's peasantry and working class. Hunan, like much of China at the time, was mired in social and economic turmoil. The collapse of the Qing dynasty and the establishment of the Republic of China had done little to alleviate the hardships faced by ordinary people. Warlordism plagued the region, with local military leaders wielding unchecked power, often at the expense of the rural population. Farmers were burdened by heavy taxes, landlords extracted exorbitant rents, and famine loomed in many areas. For Mao, these conditions underscored the urgent need for change, and he was determined to play a leading role in bringing it about. Mao's initial efforts in Hunan focused on education and organizing. Upon his return, he took up a position as a teacher at a local primary school, a role that allowed him to interact directly with young minds and instill in them the seeds of revolutionary thought. However, Mao quickly realized that education alone would not be enough to effect the kind of transformation he envisioned. He began to shift his focus toward grassroots organizing, working to build networks of activists who could challenge the existing social and political order. In 1920, Mao founded a number of organizations in Hunan, including study groups and political clubs, to foster dialogue and collaboration among like-minded individuals. These groups were often composed of students, intellectuals, and laborers who shared a desire for reform and a vision of a more equitable society. Through these activities, Mao honed his skills as a leader and organizer, learning how to motivate and inspire others to take action. His ability to connect with people from diverse backgrounds, combined with his deep understanding of their struggles, made him an effective and charismatic figure in the burgeoning revolutionary movement. One of Mao's key contributions during this period was his advocacy for labor rights. In Changsha, the capital of Hunan, he became involved in organizing workers in various industries, including railroads, coal mining, and textiles. He helped establish labor unions and encouraged workers to demand better wages, improved working conditions, and protections against exploitation. Mao's focus on labor issues was informed by his belief in the power of collective action and the potential of ordinary people to drive social change. While many of his contemporaries focused on urban intellectuals and elites, Mao's attention to the needs of workers and peasants set him apart as a leader with a unique vision for China's future. It was also during this time that Mao began to deepen his engagement with Marxism and socialism. He continued to read extensively, drawing inspiration from the writings of Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and Vladimir Lenin. The success of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia served as a powerful example of what could be achieved through organized revolutionary struggle. Mao became increasingly convinced that Marxist principles could be adapted to China's unique circumstances, particularly its predominantly agrarian society. Unlike in industrialized nations, where Marxism emphasized the role of the proletariat, Mao saw the Chinese peasantry as the key to revolutionary success. In 1921, Mao's growing involvement in revolutionary activities led him to participate in a momentous event in modern Chinese history, the founding of the Communist Party of China, CPC. The inaugural Congress held in Shanghai brought together a small group of like-minded revolutionaries from across the country, including Chen Duxiu and Li Dezhou, who were among the party's founding members. At the time, the CPC was a fledgling organization with fewer than 60 members, but it represented a bold and radical vision for China's future, a vision centered on the principles of Marxism-Leninism and the goal of establishing a classless society. Mao's participation in the founding Congress marked a turning point in his political career. Although he was initially a relatively junior figure within the party, his involvement gave him access to a broader network of revolutionaries and positioned him within the national movement for social and political change. Mao's contributions to the Congress reflected his belief in the importance of grassroots organizing and his conviction that the peasantry would play a central role in China's revolutionary struggle. These ideas, though not yet fully embraced by the party's leadership, would become defining elements of Mao's vision in the years to come. Following the establishment of the CPC, Mao returned to Hunan with renewed energy and a clearer sense of purpose. He began working to build the party's presence in the province, recruiting new members and establishing local branches. Mao's approach was pragmatic and focused on building alliances with existing organizations and movements. He worked closely with labor unions, peasant associations, and student groups, using these platforms to disseminate communist ideas and rally support for the revolutionary cause. Mao's work in Hunan was not without challenges. The region's political landscape was dominated by conservative forces, including warlords, landlords, and officials loyal to the Republican government. These groups were deeply opposed to the radical changes advocated by the CPC and often responded with violence and repression. Mao himself faced threats to his safety and was forced to navigate a perilous environment where his activities were constantly monitored. Despite these obstacles, Mao's determination remained unshaken, and his efforts began to yield tangible results. One of Mao's most significant achievements during this period was his role in organizing peasant associations in Hunan. These associations, which aimed to improve the lives of rural farmers, became a vital part of the revolutionary movement. Mao's ability to articulate the grievances of the peasantry and offer practical solutions to their problems earned him the trust and admiration of many rural communities. His writings from this time, including essays on the conditions of Hunan's peasants, reflect his deep commitment to addressing the systemic inequalities that had long plagued China's countryside. By the early 1920s, Mao Zedong had established himself as a rising star within the Communist Party and a tireless advocate for the oppressed. His work in Hunan laid the foundation for the broader revolutionary movement that would eventually sweep across China. While he was still years away from achieving national prominence, Mao's experiences during this formative period were instrumental in shaping his ideology, leadership style, and understanding of the revolutionary process. This conviction, forged in the crucible of his early activism, would drive Mao's actions in the decades to come as he sought to transform his vision into reality. Part 5, Alliance and Conflict. The early years of the Chinese Communist Party. By the early 1920s, Mao Zedong's efforts in Hunan had made him a key figure in the Communist Party of China, CPC. His grassroots organizing among workers and peasants, as well as his ability to articulate the frustrations of China's impoverished rural majority, positioned him as an advocate for the masses in a party that was still heavily influenced by urban intellectuals. However, as the CPC sought to expand its influence, it faced immense challenges from both internal divisions and external threats. These years marked a critical period of growth, alliances, and emerging tensions within the party and Mao's role within it. The formation of the First United Front. During its infancy, the CPC recognized that it was too small and under-resourced to challenge the powerful forces aligned against it, including the warlords who controlled vast regions of China and the Republican government in Beijing. To strengthen its position, the party leadership decided to form an alliance with the Kuomintang, KMT, also known as the Nationalist Party. The KMT, under the leadership of Sun Yat-sen, shared the communist goal of overthrowing the warlords and unifying China, albeit with significant ideological differences. Where the CPC envisioned a Marxist-inspired society, the KMT was more moderate, advocating for a republican government that incorporated elements of socialism and capitalism. This alliance, known as the First United Front, was formalized in 1923 with the encouragement and support of the Soviet Union. The Soviets saw an opportunity to spread their influence in China by fostering cooperation between the KMT and CPC. Soviet advisors were sent to both parties to provide guidance, and significant financial and military assistance flowed into China to aid the anti-warlord campaign. Mao, along with other communist leaders, was tasked with working within this alliance, despite the ideological compromises it required. For Mao, the First United Front presented both opportunities and challenges. On one hand, the alliance allowed the CPC to operate under the relative protection of the KMT and gave its members access to the Nationalist Party's broader organizational infrastructure. On the other hand, it required the communists to subordinate their revolutionary goals to the more moderate aims of the KMT. Mao, like many others in the CPC, viewed the alliance as a tactical necessity rather than a permanent arrangement, believing that the communists would eventually need to assert their independence. Mao's work in the United Front. During the years of the First United Front, Mao focused his efforts on building support for the revolution in rural areas, particularly in his home province of Hunan. While many of his contemporaries within the CPC concentrated on organizing urban workers, Mao remained convinced that China's peasantry held the key to the country's future. This belief set him apart from the mainstream of the communist movement, which, following Marxist orthodoxy, emphasized the role of the industrial proletariat as the driving force of revolution. Mao's work in Hunan during this period included the establishment of peasant associations, which aimed to address the grievances of rural farmers and build a network of support for the communist cause. He encouraged peasants to resist exploitative landlords, reduce rents, and challenge the traditional power structures that had long dominated rural life. Mao's ability to connect with ordinary farmers and articulate their struggles earned him widespread respect and loyalty, but it also attracted the attention of local authorities and landowners, who viewed his activities as a direct threat to their interests. In addition to his organizing efforts, Mao played an important role in spreading revolutionary ideas through his writings. His essays and articles, many of which were published in local newspapers, highlighted the plight of the peasantry and called for radical reforms to address their suffering. These writings not only reinforced Mao's reputation as a champion of the rural poor, but also began to articulate the theoretical foundation of what would later become his unique interpretation of Marxism. One that placed the peasantry, rather than the urban working class, at the center of revolutionary change. The death of Sun Yat-sen and the rise of Chiang Kai-shek. The delicate alliance between the CPC and KMT was put to the test in 1925 with the death of Sun Yat-sen, the founder and leader of the KMT. Sun's death created a power vacuum within the Nationalist Party, and a struggle for leadership ensued. Ultimately, the mantle of leadership passed to Chiang Kai-shek, a military commander with a more conservative vision for China. Unlike Sun, who had been relatively tolerant of communist participation in the KMT, Chiang viewed the CPC with suspicion and increasingly saw it as a threat to his authority. Under Chiang's leadership, the KMT launched the Northern Expedition in 1926, a military campaign aimed at defeating the warlords who controlled much of northern China. The campaign was initially successful, and the United Front appeared to be achieving its goal of national unification. Mao, along with other communist leaders, played a supporting role in the campaign, organizing peasants and workers in the territories liberated by the KMT and building support for the revolution. However, as the KMT's power grew, so did the tensions between the nationalists and communists. Many within the KMT, particularly its right-wing factions, resented the growing influence of the CPC and feared that the communists would use their position within the United Front to undermine the Nationalist Party's authority. These fears were exacerbated by the growing presence of Soviet advisors, who were seen as pushing a communist agenda. The split between the KMT and CPC, the fragile alliance between the KMT and CPC, came to a violent end in 1927 during what is now known as the White Terror. As the Northern Expedition advanced, Chiang Kai-shek launched a series of purges against the communists, targeting their organizations and supporters. In cities like Shanghai, communist leaders and activists were arrested, tortured, and executed by the thousands. The crackdown marked the beginning of open hostilities between the KMT and CPC, ushering in a new phase of the Chinese Civil War. For Mao, the events of 1927 were a turning point. The collapse of the United Front and the brutal repression of communists by the KMT forced the CPC to reevaluate its strategy. Many party leaders, who had previously focused on urban organizing and worker movements, began to recognize the importance of the countryside as a base for revolutionary activity, a perspective that Mao had long advocated. In the aftermath of the White Terror, Mao retreated to the countryside with a group of loyal followers. It was during this time that he began to develop the strategies and tactics of guerrilla warfare that would later become a hallmark of the communist movement. Mao's emphasis on building rural bases and mobilizing the peasantry laid the groundwork for the eventual resurgence of the CPC and its ultimate victory in the Chinese Civil War. This period of alliance and conflict was instrumental in shaping Mao's political ideology and leadership style. The lessons he learned about the importance of adaptability, grassroots organizing, and the need to confront entrenched power structures would guide him throughout his revolutionary career. Despite the setbacks and betrayals of the late 1920s, Mao emerged from this tumultuous period with a clearer vision of how to achieve his revolutionary goals and a renewed determination to transform China. Part 6. Retreat to the countryside and the birth of Mao's revolutionary strategy. The violent rupture between the Kuomintang, KMT, and the Chinese Communist Party, CPC, in 1927 had devastating consequences for the fledgling communist movement. The White Terror, orchestrated by Chiang Kai-shek, left thousands of communist supporters dead, including many of the party's most promising leaders and organizers. For Mao Zedong, this was not just a moment of crisis, but also one of profound transformation. In the face of near-total annihilation, Mao began to develop a revolutionary strategy that would ultimately redefine the course of the communist movement in China. The Jinggang Mountains, a new beginning. After the KMT's betrayal and the collapse of the First United Front, Mao sought refuge in the remote Jinggang Mountains, located on the border of Hunan and Jiangxi provinces. The rugged and isolated terrain of this region offered a natural sanctuary for the remnants of the communist forces. It was here that Mao began to rebuild and reimagine the revolutionary movement, laying the groundwork for what would eventually become the CPC's strategy of rural insurgency. Mao arrived in the Jinggang Mountains in the late 1920s, accompanied by a small band of followers, including peasants, workers, and former soldiers. The group was poorly equipped and demoralized, but Mao quickly recognized the potential of the region as a revolutionary base. The mountains provided not only physical protection from KMT forces, but also access to a large population of disenfranchised peasants who were eager for change. Mao's decision to focus on the countryside, rather than the urban centers that had traditionally been the focus of communist efforts, marked a significant departure from the orthodox Marxist approach. One of Mao's first priorities in the Jinggang Mountains was to establish a stable base of operations. He worked to organize the local population, forming peasant associations and encouraging farmers to join the revolutionary cause. Mao's approach was pragmatic and deeply attuned to the needs and concerns of the rural population. He implemented land reforms, redistributing property from landlords to impoverished peasants, and established policies aimed at improving living conditions. These measures not only alleviated some of the immediate hardships faced by the peasants, but also helped to build trust and loyalty among the local population. Guerrilla warfare, the seeds of a new strategy. In addition to organizing the local population, Mao began to develop a new military strategy that would define the CPC's approach to warfare for decades to come. Drawing on his experiences in the Northern Expedition and the lessons of the Russian Revolution, Mao adapted the principles of guerrilla warfare to the unique conditions of rural China. He recognized that the CPC, with its limited resources and manpower, could not hope to defeat the KMT in conventional battles. Instead, he advocated for a strategy of protracted struggle, relying on mobility, surprise, and the support of the local population to outmaneuver and wear down the enemy. Mao's early experiments with guerrilla warfare in the Jinggang Mountains were met with mixed results. While his forces achieved some successes against local warlords and KMT troops, they also faced significant challenges, including supply shortages, internal dissent, and the constant threat of encirclement by superior forces. Despite these difficulties, Mao's emphasis on adaptability and his willingness to learn from mistakes allowed him to refine his tactics and build a more cohesive fighting force. One of the key elements of Mao's strategy was the integration of political and military objectives. He believed that the success of the revolutionary movement depended not only on military victories, but also on the ability to win the hearts and minds of the people. To this end, Mao placed a strong emphasis on political education, ensuring that his troops understood the goals of the revolution and treated the local population with respect. This approach contrasted sharply with the often brutal tactics employed by the KMT and other factions, further strengthening the CPC's appeal among the rural population. Consolidation and growth, the Red Army and the Jiangxi Soviet. By 1930, Mao's efforts in the Jinggang Mountains had begun to bear fruit. His forces, now known as the Red Army, had grown significantly in size and capability, thanks in part to defections from the KMT and the recruitment of local peasants. The Red Army's successes in the region attracted the attention of the broader communist movement, and Mao's leadership gained recognition within the CPC. In 1931, Mao and his allies established the Jiangxi Soviet, a self-governing communist enclave in Jiangxi Province. The Jiangxi Soviet represented a bold experiment in revolutionary governance, with Mao serving as its de facto leader. Under his direction, the Soviet implemented sweeping reforms aimed at transforming the region into a model of socialist society. Land redistribution was expanded, with the property of landlords confiscated and redistributed to peasants. Education and healthcare programs were introduced, and efforts were made to improve agricultural productivity and local infrastructure. The Jiangxi Soviet also became a laboratory for Mao's evolving political ideology. It was during this period that he began to articulate his vision of a Chinese-style Marxism that emphasized the central role of the peasantry in the revolutionary struggle. While this approach was initially met with skepticism by some within the CPC, who remained committed to a more orthodox Marxist framework, Mao's successes in Jiangxi lent credibility to his ideas. Challenges and setbacks, the encirclement campaigns, the establishment of the Jiangxi Soviet did not go unnoticed by the KMT, which viewed the communist enclave as a direct challenge to its authority. Beginning in the early 1930s, Chiang Kai-shek launched a series of encirclement campaigns aimed at crushing the Jiangxi Soviet and eliminating the communist threat. These campaigns involved large-scale military operations, with KMT forces attempting to surround and annihilate the Red Army. Mao's response to these encirclement campaigns was rooted in the principles of guerrilla warfare he had developed in the Jinggang Mountains. Rather than engaging the KMT in direct confrontations, the Red Army employed hit-and-run tactics, ambushing enemy forces and disrupting their supply lines. Mao's strategy relied heavily on the support of the local population, who provided intelligence, supplies, and shelter to the Red Army. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, the communists managed to repel several of the KMT's campaigns, further solidifying Mao's reputation as a brilliant military strategist. However, the Red Army's resistance came at a heavy cost. The constant fighting took a toll on both the troops and the civilian population, and the Jiangxi Soviet faced severe shortages of food and resources. Internal divisions within the CPC also posed significant challenges, as disagreements over strategy and ideology threatened to undermine the movement's cohesion. Mao's leadership was frequently questioned by rivals within the party, forcing him to navigate a complex web of political and military challenges. The stage is set for the Long March. By 1934, the situation in the Jiangxi Soviet had become increasingly untenable. The KMT's fifth encirclement campaign, launched with the support of German military advisors, proved to be more effective than its predecessors. Chiang Kai-shek employed a strategy of gradual attrition, building fortified positions and cutting off the Red Army's access to supplies and reinforcements. Facing the prospect of total annihilation, Mao and the communist leadership made the difficult decision to abandon the Jiangxi Soviet and embark on a strategic retreat. This retreat, which would later become known as the Long March, marked the beginning of one of the most dramatic and consequential chapters in Mao's life. The hardships and triumphs of the Long March would not only solidify Mao's position as the undisputed leader of the CPC, but also become a defining moment in the history of the Chinese Revolution. Part 7, The Long March. Survival and Ascendancy. The Long March, which began in October 1934, stands as one of the most pivotal and dramatic events in the history of the Chinese Communist Party, CPC. It was both a desperate bid for survival and an extraordinary display of endurance and determination. For Mao Zedong, the Long March represented a turning point in his rise to leadership and a critical moment in shaping the identity of the communist movement in China. The decision to retreat. By mid-1934, the situation in the Jiangxi Soviet had become dire. The fifth encirclement campaign launched by Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang, the KMT, employed a new strategy of gradual strangulation. Instead of launching direct assaults, the KMT forces surrounded the communist stronghold, cutting off vital supplies and reinforcements. Facing certain defeat, the CPC leadership decided to evacuate their base in Jiangxi and undertake a strategic retreat. The decision to embark on the Long March was not without controversy. Within the CPC, debates raged over how best to respond to the KMT's encirclement. Some leaders advocated for continued resistance, while others argued for an immediate retreat. Mao, who had already begun to assert his authority within the party, supported the idea of retreat as a way to preserve the core of the communist movement and regroup in a more favorable location. His position was ultimately adopted, though it was clear that the march would be fraught with peril. The journey begins. In October 1934, approximately 86,000 Red Army soldiers, along with 15,000 civilian personnel and essential supplies, began their epic journey. The goal was to break through the KMT's encirclement and reach a safer base in northwestern China, where the terrain and remoteness would offer better protection. The marchers carried with them limited supplies, including weapons, ammunition, and food, as well as essential equipment for constructing temporary bridges and shelters. The scale of the undertaking was staggering. Over the course of the next year, the marchers would cover approximately 6,000 miles, crossing 24 rivers and 18 mountain ranges. The terrain was harsh and unforgiving, ranging from swampy lowlands to frigid highlands. The marchers endured extreme weather conditions, including torrential rains, blistering heat, and freezing cold. Hunger, disease, and exhaustion took a devastating toll on the troops and civilians alike. Battles and hardships. The Long March was not merely a logistical challenge, it was also a military campaign. The Red Army faced constant attacks from KMT forces and local warlords who sought to impede their progress. In some instances, the marchers had to engage in pitched battles to break through enemy lines. One of the most notable encounters occurred at the Shang River, where the Red Army suffered heavy casualties while attempting to cross under relentless enemy fire. This early setback highlighted the immense challenges of the journey and underscored the need for effective leadership. In addition to external threats, the marchers faced significant internal challenges. Morale often wavered as the hardships of the journey mounted. Food shortages were a constant problem, forcing the marchers to forage for wild plants and hunt for game. Many fell ill from malnutrition and diseases such as dysentery and malaria. The lack of proper medical care compounded the suffering, and countless lives were lost along the way. Despite these difficulties, the marchers displayed remarkable resilience and determination. Mao's leadership played a crucial role in maintaining morale and unity within the Red Army. His ability to inspire confidence and articulate a clear vision for the future of the revolution helped sustain the marchers through their darkest moments. Mao's growing influence within the party was solidified during this period, as his pragmatic approach to survival and strategy earned him the trust and loyalty of his comrades. The Zunyi Conference, Mao's rise to power. One of the most critical moments of the Long March occurred in January 1935, when the CPC leadership held a meeting in the town of Zunyi in Guizhou Province. The Zunyi Conference was convened to address the numerous setbacks the Red Army had suffered during the early stages of the march. It was also an opportunity for Mao to challenge the existing leadership and assert his vision for the party's future. During the conference, Mao criticized the military strategies employed by the CPC's then dominant leaders, including Otto Braun, a German communist advisor sent by the Comintern. Mao argued that their reliance on conventional warfare tactics had been disastrous and proposed a shift toward a more flexible, guerrilla-based approach. His arguments resonated with many party members who were disillusioned with the current leadership's failures. The outcome of the Zunyi Conference was a significant turning point for both Mao and the CPC. Mao was elevated to a position of greater authority within the party, effectively becoming its principal strategist and de facto leader. His emphasis on adaptability, grassroots support, and guerrilla tactics would shape the CPC's approach to revolutionary warfare for years to come. The march continues, survival against all odds. Following the Zunyi Conference, the Red Army adopted new strategies that prioritize mobility and evasion over direct confrontation. These tactics allowed the marchers to outmaneuver KMT forces and continue their journey despite overwhelming odds. Mao's leadership became increasingly evident as he guided the army through some of the most treacherous stretches of the march. One of the most iconic episodes of the Long March was the crossing of the Looting Bridge in May 1935. The bridge, a narrow suspension structure spanning the Dadu River, was a critical choke point that had to be captured to ensure the Red Army's safe passage. Mao's forces executed a daring assault under heavy fire, successfully seizing the bridge and securing a vital victory. The crossing of the Looting Bridge became a symbol of the Red Army's courage and determination. As the march progressed, the Red Army continued to face immense challenges. The trek through the snowy mountains of the Tibetan Plateau and the arid grasslands of western China tested the limits of human endurance. By the time the marchers reached their destination in Shaoshan Province in October 1935, their numbers had dwindled dramatically. Of the approximately 86,000 people who had set out from Jiangxi, only about 4,000 survived the journey. Legacy of the Long March. The Long March was a moment of profound transformation for the CPC and its leadership. Although it was a tactical retreat, it became a powerful symbol of resilience, sacrifice, and revolutionary zeal. For Mao Zedong, the march was the culmination of years of struggle and an affirmation of his vision for the communist movement. His leadership during the Long March solidified his position as the undisputed leader of the CPC and laid the foundation for his future role as the architect of the Chinese Revolution. The march also had a lasting impact on the identity and mythology of the CPC. It was celebrated as a heroic epic, demonstrating the party's commitment to the people and its ability to overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges. The stories of the Long March inspired generations of Chinese communists and became a central part of the party's narrative of legitimacy. As Mao and the surviving marchers settled into their new base in Shanxi, they began to rebuild and reorganize the communist movement. The lessons learned during the Long March would shape the CPC's strategies in the years ahead as it prepared for the next phase of the revolution. For Mao, the journey marked the beginning of his ascent to national leadership and the realization of his vision for a transformed China. Part 8, the Yan'an Years and Consolidation of Mao's Leadership. After the grueling ordeal of the Long March, Mao Zedong and the remaining communist forces settled in the remote and rugged region of Yan'an in Shanxi Province in late 1935. For Mao and the Communist Party of China, CPC, Yan'an became much more than just a sanctuary. It was a crucible for ideological development, military reorganization, and political consolidation. The years in Yan'an, stretching from the mid-1930s to the mid-1940s, would prove transformative as Mao solidified his leadership, honed his revolutionary strategy, and laid the groundwork for the eventual triumph of the communist movement. Establishing the Yan'an base. The remote location of Yan'an offered the CPC a secure refuge far from the reach of Kuomintang, KMT forces. The region was sparsely populated, underdeveloped, and impoverished, but its isolation provided an ideal environment for rebuilding the communist movement. The Yan'an base served as both a headquarters and a model of the socialist society the CPC hoped to create. Under Mao's leadership, the communists began transforming the area into a functioning revolutionary enclave. Land reform was one of the first priorities in Yan'an. The CPC implemented policies to redistribute land from wealthy landlords to poor peasants, winning the support of the rural population. Education initiatives were also launched, with schools established to teach literacy and political ideology to both soldiers and civilians. These programs aimed to empower the local population while fostering loyalty to the communist cause. The Yan'an base became a testing ground for the CPC's broader social and economic policies, which emphasized equality, collective work, and the integration of political and military efforts. Ideological development and Mao's thought. The Yan'an period was pivotal in the development of Mao's unique brand of Marxism, later known as Mao Zedong thought. While Marxist ideology had its roots in the industrialized societies of Europe, Mao adapted it to the agrarian realities of China. He argued that the peasantry, rather than the urban proletariat, should be the primary revolutionary force in China. This perspective, which had already guided Mao's actions during the Jinggang Mountains years and the Long March, became more refined and systematic during his time in Yan'an. Mao's writings during this period, including works such as On Contradiction and On Practice, articulated his philosophical approach to revolution. He emphasized the importance of understanding and addressing the specific conditions of China, rejecting dogmatic adherence to foreign models. Mao also underscored the significance of mass mobilization, arguing that the success of the revolution depended on the active participation of ordinary people. These ideas laid the foundation for Maoism, which would become the guiding ideology of the CPC. Rectification campaigns and consolidation of power. While the Yan'an years were marked by innovation and progress, they were also a time of internal strife and political consolidation. As the CPC grew in size and influence, Mao sought to establish himself as the undisputed leader of the party. To achieve this, he launched a series of rectification campaigns, beginning in 1942, aimed at rooting out dissent and enforcing ideological conformity within the party. The rectification campaigns involved extensive political education, self-criticism sessions, and purges of individuals deemed disloyal or ideologically impure. While these campaigns helped to unify the party and strengthen Mao's control, They were also marked by coercion and brutality. Many party members were subjected to harsh interrogations, forced confessions, and even imprisonment. The campaigns left a lasting legacy of fear and obedience within the CPC, ensuring that Mao's authority would go unchallenged for years to come. Despite their harsh methods, the rectification campaign succeeded in creating a more disciplined and cohesive party. They also allowed Mao to cement his ideological vision as the official doctrine of the CPC. By the end of the Yan'an period, Mao Zedong thought had become the guiding framework for the party, and Mao's leadership was firmly established. The Second United Front and the war against Japan. The outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937 presented both challenges and opportunities for the CPC. The Japanese invasion of China had plunged the country into chaos, as the KMT struggled to mount an effective defense. Faced with the existential threat posed by Japan, the CPC and KMT agreed to form a second united front, setting aside their ideological differences to fight a common enemy. For the CPC, the Second United Front was a tactical alliance rather than a genuine partnership. While the KMT bore the brunt of the fighting against Japan, the Communists used the opportunity to expand their influence and build their forces. Mao directed the Red Army to engage in guerrilla warfare behind Japanese lines, targeting enemy supply routes and weakening the occupation forces. These tactics not only disrupted the Japanese war effort, but also allowed the CPC to establish a network of bases and win the support of the rural population in occupied areas. The war against Japan further highlighted the contrasting approaches of the CPC and KMT. While the KMT's leadership under Chiang Kai-shek was often criticized for corruption and inefficiency, the CPC presented itself as a disciplined and effective force that was genuinely committed to the well-being of the Chinese people. This contrast enhanced the CPC's reputation and attracted new supporters, including intellectuals, students, and rural workers. Expansion of the Red Army. During the Yan'an years, the CPC experienced significant growth in both its membership and its military capacity. The Red Army, which had been severely weakened during the Long March, was rebuilt and rebranded as the 8th Route Army and the new 4th Army. These forces became key players in the anti-Japanese resistance, earning respect for their effectiveness and discipline. By the early 1940s, the Red Army had grown to nearly 500,000 troops, bolstered by recruits from rural areas and defectors from the KMT. This expansion reflected the CPC's ability to mobilize the masses and adapt to changing circumstances. The Red Army's emphasis on guerrilla warfare, combined with its integration of political education and propaganda, made it a formidable force that would play a decisive role in the later stages of the Chinese Civil War. Life in Yan'an and Mao's personal relationships. Life in Yan'an was marked by a sense of purpose and shared struggle. The Communists fostered a culture of egalitarianism, with leaders and rank-and-file members sharing the hardships of daily life. Mao, however, was already beginning to enjoy certain privileges that set him apart from his comrades. As the undisputed leader of the CPC, he occupied a position of considerable authority, and his personal decisions often carried significant political implications. During the Yan'an period, Mao's personal life underwent notable changes. In 1938, he married Jiang Qing, an actress who would later play a controversial role in the Cultural Revolution. Jiang Qing was Mao's fourth wife, and their relationship was characterized by both collaboration and tension. While Jiang Qing supported Mao's political ambitions, her own aspirations for power would later create divisions within the CPC. The legacy of Yan'an. The Yan'an years were a defining period in Mao Zedong's life and the history of the Communist Party of China. It was in Yan'an that Mao emerged as the paramount leader of the CPC, solidified his ideological framework, and demonstrated his ability to adapt Marxism to the realities of Chinese society. The base in Yan'an became a symbol of the CPC's resilience and resourcefulness, as well as a training ground for the leaders and cadres who would later guide the revolution to victory. As World War II drew to a close and Japan's defeat became inevitable, the stage was set for the resumption of the Chinese Civil War between the CPC and the KMT. With its base in Yan'an and its growing support among the Chinese people, the CPC was now better positioned than ever to challenge the KMT's dominance. For Mao, the lessons of the Yan'an years would prove invaluable as he prepared to lead the next phase of the revolution. Part 9. The resumption of civil war and the road to victory. As the Second World War came to an end in 1945, China found itself at a crossroads. The Japanese occupation had devastated much of the country, but it had also created opportunities for the Communist Party of China, CPC, to expand its influence and strengthen its position. With Japan's surrender in August 1945, the fragile alliance between the CPC and the Kuomintang, KMT under Chiang Kai-shek, dissolved, and the two sides resumed their bitter struggle for control of China. This renewed conflict, known as the Chinese Civil War, would ultimately culminate in the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949 under Mao Zedong's leadership. The collapse of the Second United Front. The Second United Front, formed in 1937 to combat the Japanese invasion, had always been a marriage of convenience rather than a genuine partnership. Throughout the war, tensions between the CPC and KMT simmered beneath the surface, as both sides pursued their own agendas. While the KMT focused on conventional warfare against Japan, the CPC concentrated on guerrilla tactics, building rural bases, and expanding its support among the peasantry. By the time Japan surrendered, the two parties were deeply mistrustful of each other, and their ideological differences had only widened. The immediate aftermath of the war saw both the CPC and KMT vying for control of liberated territories. The CPC, now headquartered in Yan'an, was in a strong position, having built a network of bases and established a substantial military force. The Red Army, which had grown to over 1 million troops, was well trained in guerrilla warfare and had the support of millions of rural Chinese. The KMT, though larger and better equipped, was weakened by corruption, inefficiency, and low morale. These disparities set the stage for the renewed conflict. The Soviet factor and the struggle for Manchuria. One of the most critical developments in the early stages of the renewed civil war was the struggle for control of Manchuria, a resource-rich region in northeastern China. At the time of Japan's surrender, Soviet forces occupied Manchuria, having launched a military campaign against Japanese forces there in August 1945. The Soviets, while officially neutral in the Chinese Civil War, played a key role in shaping the conflict by providing material and logistical support to the CPC. Mao Zedong and other communist leaders recognized the strategic importance of Manchuria and prioritized its capture. With Soviet assistance, the Red Army moved swiftly to secure key cities and infrastructure in the region. The CPC also mobilized local support, leveraging its land reform policies and promises of social justice to win over the population. By late 1946, the Communists had established a strong foothold in Manchuria, which would serve as a critical base for their operations in the years to come. The KMT's weaknesses and the CPC's advantages. As the Civil War escalated, the weaknesses of the KMT became increasingly apparent. Despite its initial advantages in numbers and resources, the KMT struggled to maintain cohesion and public support. Corruption was rampant within Chiang Kai-shek's government, and many soldiers in the Nationalist Army were poorly trained, underpaid, and demoralized. The KMT's reliance on foreign aid, particularly from the United States, also fueled resentment among the Chinese population, who viewed the party as beholden to foreign interests. In contrast, the CPC capitalized on its reputation as a disciplined and effective force that prioritized the needs of ordinary Chinese people. Land reform remained a central pillar of the communist strategy, as the CPC redistributed land from landlords to peasants, earning widespread support in rural areas. The Red Army's emphasis on political education and fair treatment of civilians further enhanced the CPC's appeal. By positioning itself as the champion of China's marginalized and oppressed, the CPC was able to build a broad base of support that extended beyond the peasantry to include students, intellectuals, and urban workers. The turning point. The Huaihai and Pingjin campaigns. The decisive phase of the Civil War began in late 1948 with two major military campaigns that shifted the balance of power in favor of the CPC, the Huaihai campaign and the Pingjin campaign. The Huaihai campaign, which lasted from November 1948 to January 1949, was a massive engagement in east-central China that pitted the Red Army against the KMT's best forces. The Communists employed a strategy of encirclement and attrition, isolating KMT troops and cutting off their supplies. The campaign was marked by widespread mobilization of local peasants, who provided logistical support to the Red Army, including transporting supplies and constructing fortifications. By the end of the campaign, the KMT had suffered devastating losses, with over 500,000 of its troops killed, captured, or wounded. The Pingjin campaign, which followed in the winter of 1948-1949, targeted northern China, including the region around Beijing, then called Beiping. Over the course of 2 months, the Red Army systematically encircled and defeated KMT forces in the north, capturing key cities and consolidating communist control over the region. The fall of Beijing in January 1949 was a symbolic victory for the CPC, signaling the near-total collapse of the KMT's position in northern China. Mao's leadership and strategy. Mao Zedong's leadership during the Civil War was instrumental in the CPC's success. His ability to adapt Marxist principles to China's unique conditions and his emphasis on mass mobilization were key factors in the communist victory. Mao's focus on guerrilla warfare, combined with a pragmatic approach to alliances and strategy, allowed the Red Army to outmaneuver and outlast the better-equipped but less cohesive KMT forces. Mao also demonstrated a keen understanding of the political dimensions of the war. He recognized that the CPC's success depended not only on military victories, but also on its ability to win the support of the Chinese people. Through land reform, propaganda, and efforts to address local grievances, Mao and the CPC positioned themselves as the legitimate representatives of China's future. The fall of the KMT and the establishment of the People's Republic of China. By the spring of 1949, the KMT's position had become untenable. Chiang Kai-shek and his remaining forces retreated southward, eventually fleeing to the island of Taiwan, where they established a government in exile. Meanwhile, the CPC pressed its advantage, capturing key cities across China. On April 23, 1949, the Red Army seized Nanjing, the KMT's capital, marking the symbolic end of nationalist rule on the mainland. On October 1, 1949, Mao Zedong stood atop the Gate of Heavenly Peace in Beijing and proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China, PRC. This moment marked the culmination of decades of struggle and the beginning of a new era in Chinese history. The establishment of the PRC signaled the triumph of the Communist Revolution and the realization of Mao's vision for a socialist China. Part 10. Consolidating Power and Shaping the People's Republic of China. With the establishment of the People's Republic of China, PRC, on October 1, 1949, Mao Zedong stood at the helm of a nation that had undergone decades of turmoil, foreign domination, and civil war. Yet the triumph of the Communist Revolution was only the beginning of a monumental task, unifying a fragmented country, rebuilding its shattered infrastructure, and transforming China into a socialist state. The early years of the PRC were characterized by sweeping reforms, ambitious economic initiatives, and the consolidation of Mao's authority as the supreme leader of the Chinese Communist Party, CPC, and the nation. The aftermath of victory. When Mao and the CPC assumed control of China, they inherited a country ravaged by war and deeply divided along regional, social, and economic lines. The Civil War had left much of the infrastructure in ruins, the economy was in disarray, and millions of people faced poverty, famine, and displacement. The challenges of governance were immense, and the new communist government wasted no time in implementing measures to address these issues. The CPC's initial priorities were to stabilize the country, eliminate remaining opposition, and consolidate its hold on power. Mao recognized the importance of presenting the PRC as a unified and legitimate government, capable of addressing the needs of its people. In the months following the founding of the PRC, the Red Army was deployed to suppress pockets of resistance from KMT loyalists, bandits, and warlord factions that still operated in remote regions. By 1950, most of these threats had been neutralized, and the CPC's control over mainland China was firmly established. Land reform and the redistribution of wealth. One of the most significant and transformative policies of the early PRC was land reform. Mao and the CPC had long identified land ownership as a key source of inequality and exploitation in Chinese society. Under the feudal system that had dominated rural China for centuries, a small class of landlords owned vast amounts of farmland, while the majority of peasants worked as tenants or laborers, subject to exorbitant rents and harsh conditions. Beginning in the early 1950s, the communist government launched a nationwide land reform campaign aimed at redistributing land from landlords to peasants. The campaign was marked by mass mobilization, as local peasant associations were empowered to identify landlords, seize their property, and distribute the land among the poor. The process often involved public trials and denunciations of landlords, some of which escalated into violence. Thousands of landlords were executed or imprisoned, and their wealth was confiscated. While the land reform campaign was controversial and brutal in many areas, it succeeded in fundamentally transforming rural China. By the mid-1950s, an estimated 300 million peasants had received land, significantly reducing economic inequality and improving the livelihoods of millions. The campaign also strengthened the CPC's support base in the countryside, as many peasants viewed the communist government as a champion of their interests. The first five-year plan, industrialization and modernization, inspired by the Soviet model of centralized economic planning, Mao and the CPC launched the first five-year plan in 1953. The plan aimed to transition China from an agrarian economy to an industrial powerhouse, with a focus on heavy industry, infrastructure development, and collectivization of agriculture. With financial and technical assistance from the Soviet Union, the Chinese government invested heavily in the construction of factories, steel mills, and power plants, particularly in urban centers. The results of the first five-year plan were mixed but largely positive. Industrial output increased significantly, with production of steel, coal, and machinery rising well above pre-war levels. The plan also laid the foundation for China's future industrial development, as new transportation networks, including railways and highways, connected previously isolated regions. However, the emphasis on heavy industry often came at the expense of consumer goods and agricultural productivity, creating imbalances in the economy. In rural areas, the government began experimenting with collectivization, encouraging farmers to pool their resources and work on collective farms. While this policy was intended to increase efficiency and productivity, it met resistance from many peasants who valued their newfound land ownership. The tension between agricultural collectivization and individual land ownership would become a major source of conflict in the years to come. Political repression and the campaign against counter-revolutionaries. As the CPC worked to reshape China's economy and society, it also sought to eliminate any threats to its authority. The early 1950s saw the launch of a series of political campaigns aimed at rooting out counter-revolutionaries, a term broadly applied to anyone perceived as opposing the communist regime. These campaigns targeted former KMT officials, landlords, intellectuals, and others deemed enemies of the state. One of the most notable campaigns was the Three Anti and Five Anti movements, launched in 1951 and 1952, respectively. The Three Anti campaign focused on combating corruption, waste, and bureaucracy within the government, while the Five Anti campaign targeted bribery, tax evasion, fraud, theft of state property, and economic espionage among business owners. These movements were accompanied by mass arrests, public trials, and propaganda efforts to encourage citizens to denounce perceived counter-revolutionaries. While these campaigns helped to consolidate the CPC's control and instill discipline within the government and business sectors, they also created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion. Thousands of people were executed or imprisoned, and the widespread use of public denunciations and surveillance eroded trust within communities. Foreign relations in the Korean War. On the international stage, the early years of the PRC were shaped by its alignment with the Soviet Union and its involvement in the Korean War. In 1950, less than a year after the founding of the PRC, China entered the Korean War in support of North Korea, which was facing a United Nations-backed intervention led by the United States. Chinese troops, under the banner of the People's Volunteer Army, played a decisive role in pushing back UN forces and stabilizing the front lines along the 38th parallel. China's intervention in Korea had far-reaching consequences. It solidified the PRC's alliance with the Soviet Union and positioned China as a key player in the Cold War. However, it also strained relations with the United States, leading to a trade embargo and decades of diplomatic isolation. Despite these challenges, the war bolstered Mao's image as a leader who was willing to stand up to foreign powers and defend China's sovereignty. Mao's consolidation of power. During the first few years of the PRC, Mao Zedong worked tirelessly to consolidate his position as the supreme leader of China. His dual role as chairman of the CPC and head of state allowed him to wield immense power, and his influence within the party ensured that his policies were implemented with little opposition. Mao's speeches, writings, and personal charisma reinforced his image as the architect of the revolution and the guiding force behind China's transformation. At the same time, Mao began to cultivate a cult of personality, with propaganda campaigns portraying him as an infallible leader and the savior of the Chinese people. Portraits of Mao adorned public spaces, his quotations were studied and memorized, and his image became synonymous with the Communist Party itself. This cult of personality would grow in the years to come, shaping the political culture of the PRC and contributing to some of the more extreme policies of Mao's later years. The foundations of a new China. By the mid-1950s, Mao and the CPC had laid the foundations of the People's Republic of China. Through land reform, industrialization, and political campaigns, the communist government had begun to transform the country's social and economic structures. However, these early successes were accompanied by significant challenges, including resistance to collectivization, economic imbalances, and the repression of dissent. As Mao looked ahead, he envisioned a China that would not only rival the great powers of the world, but also embody the principles of socialism and equality. The next phase of his leadership would be marked by even more ambitious and controversial efforts to reshape Chinese society, culminating in the catastrophic Great Leap Forward. For now, though, Mao's vision of a united and transformed China seemed within reach. Part 11. The Great Leap Forward, Ambition and Catastrophe. By the late 1950s, Mao Zedong stood at the height of his power, having overseen the successful consolidation of the People's Republic of China and the implementation of transformative policies that had fundamentally reshaped the nation. Emboldened by the apparent success of the first five-year plan and inspired by the desire to rapidly propel China into the ranks of the world's leading industrialized nations, Mao launched an ambitious and radical economic and social initiative known as the Great Leap Forward. However, this campaign, which began in 1958, would have catastrophic consequences, leading to widespread famine and the deaths of millions. The vision behind the Great Leap Forward. The Great Leap Forward was conceived as a bold plan to accelerate China's economic development and achieve the goal of surpassing Britain in industrial output within 15 years. Mao envisioned a new model of socialist development that would rely on the collective efforts of the Chinese people, combining industrial growth with agricultural reform. At its core, the campaign aimed to harness the energy and labor of China's vast rural population to achieve rapid industrialization and agricultural modernization. One of the central features of the Great Leap Forward was the establishment of people's communes. These massive collective units, often encompassing entire villages, were designed to consolidate land, labor, and resources under communal ownership. Communes were expected to function as self-sufficient economic entities, producing food, industrial goods, and public services. Mao believed that the collectivization of agriculture would lead to increased efficiency and higher crop yields, freeing up labor for industrial projects. In addition to agricultural reform, the Great Leap Forward prioritized the rapid expansion of steel production. To achieve this, Mao encouraged the construction of backyard furnaces in rural areas, where peasants were instructed to produce steel using scrap metal and improvised equipment. This initiative was intended to demonstrate the power of mass mobilization and enable rural areas to contribute directly to China's industrial output. Early optimism and propaganda. The initial phase of the Great Leap Forward was characterized by a wave of optimism and enthusiasm. Propaganda campaigns promoted the vision of a utopian society in which collective effort and revolutionary zeal would overcome all obstacles. Slogans such as "more faster, better, cheaper," and "communism is paradise" were widely disseminated, and party officials extolled the achievements of the communes and backyard furnaces. Reports of record-breaking agricultural yields and soaring steel production figures fueled the belief that the campaign was succeeding. However, much of this optimism was based on false or exaggerated data. Local party officials, eager to demonstrate their loyalty and achieve ambitious production targets, often inflated their reports, creating the illusion of success. These exaggerated figures were celebrated at the national level, reinforcing Mao's belief that the Great Leap Forward was achieving its goals. The reality of the Great Leap Forward. Beneath the surface, the reality of the Great Leap Forward was far bleaker than the propaganda suggested. The emphasis on collectivization and industrialization disrupted traditional agricultural practices, leading to significant declines in food production. Peasants were often forced to abandon their fields to work in backyard furnaces or participate in large-scale infrastructure projects, leaving crops unharvested or improperly tended. The Backyard Furnace Initiative, one of the campaign's most infamous policies, proved to be a disastrous failure. While some steel was produced, much of it was of poor quality and unusable. The practice of melting down farming tools and household items to meet steel production quotas further exacerbated the agricultural crisis, as communities were left without the basic equipment needed to plant and harvest crops. Famine began to take hold in many parts of the country by late 1958. Poor agricultural yields, coupled with the government's insistence on exporting grain to maintain an image of prosperity, left millions without enough food to eat. The situation was compounded by natural disasters, including droughts and floods, which further reduced agricultural output. Despite these warning signs, Mao and other communist leaders continued to press forward with the campaign, convinced that any setbacks could be overcome through greater effort and revolutionary commitment. The human cost of the Great Leap Forward. The consequences of the Great Leap Forward were catastrophic. Between 1959 and 1961, China experienced one of the deadliest famines in human history. Estimates of the death toll vary, but most historians agree that at least 30 million people died from starvation, disease, and related causes. In some regions, entire villages were wiped out, and survivors resorted to desperate measures, including cannibalism, to stay alive. The famine also took a psychological toll on the Chinese population, as the sense of unity and progress that had characterized the early years of the PRC gave way to widespread suffering and disillusionment. Trust in the Communist Party was eroded, particularly in rural areas where the impact of the famine was most severe. The sheer scale of the tragedy left an indelible mark on Chinese society, shaping attitudes toward government policy and leadership for decades to come. Mao's role and the shift in leadership. As the scale of the disaster became apparent, Mao faced growing criticism from within the Communist Party. Many party officials, including prominent leaders such as Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, began to advocate for a shift in policy and greater focus on pragmatic economic reforms. Mao, while initially resistant to acknowledging the failures of the Great Leap Forward, eventually stepped back from day-to-day governance, allowing Liu, Deng, and others to take the lead in addressing the crisis. By 1962, the Great Leap Forward had been officially abandoned, and the Communist Party implemented a series of measures to stabilize the economy and rebuild agricultural production. These included the dismantling of communes, the restoration of some private farming practices, and the introduction of market-oriented policies. Under the leadership of Liu and Deng, the economy began to recover, and food production returned to pre-famine levels. While Mao retained his position as chairman of the Communist Party, the failures of the Great Leap Forward marked a significant blow to his authority. The campaign's disastrous outcomes exposed the dangers of unchecked ambition and ideological zeal, highlighting the need for a more balanced and pragmatic approach to governance. However, Mao's retreat from active leadership was temporary. By the mid-1960s, he would launch a new campaign, the Cultural Revolution, aimed at restoring his control and reshaping Chinese society once again. Lessons and legacy. The Great Leap Forward remains one of the most controversial and tragic episodes in modern Chinese history. It demonstrated the devastating consequences of utopian policies implemented without regard for practical realities or dissenting opinions. For Mao, the campaign was a deeply personal failure, one that tarnished his reputation and forced him to confront the limits of his vision for rapid industrialization and collectivization. Despite its catastrophic impact, the Great Leap Forward also left a lasting legacy. It underscored the importance of mass mobilization as a tool of governance, a theme that would re-emerge during the Cultural Revolution. It also highlighted the tension between ideology and pragmatism within the Communist Party, a conflict that would continue to shape China's political and economic trajectory in the years to come. As Mao prepared to reassert his authority, the lessons of the Great Leap Forward loomed large. The tragedy served as both a cautionary tale and a reminder of the challenges inherent in transforming a vast and diverse nation. For the Chinese people, the scars of the famine and the upheaval it caused would remain a painful part of their collective memory, shaping their understanding of leadership, policy, and progress. Part 12. The Cultural Revolution in Mao's Final Years. By the mid-1960s, Mao Zedong faced a political landscape that was vastly different from the one he had dominated in the early years of the People's Republic of China, PRC. The catastrophic failure of the Great Leap Forward had severely damaged his reputation and diminished his influence within the Communist Party of China, CPC. Pragmatic leaders like Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping had risen to prominence, steering the country toward recovery with more moderate and market-oriented policies. For Mao, this shift away from revolutionary ideals was both a personal affront and a threat to his vision of China's future. Determined to reclaim his authority and reinvigorate the revolutionary spirit, Mao launched the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution in 1966, a campaign that would profoundly reshape Chinese society and leave a deeply divisive legacy. The Cultural Revolution, Objectives and Mobilization. The Cultural Revolution was conceived as a political and social movement aimed at purging China of what Mao perceived as bourgeois and counter-revolutionary elements. He accused party officials, intellectuals, and cultural figures of embracing capitalist values and betraying the principles of socialism. Mao believed that a new class of bureaucrats had emerged within the CPC, undermining the revolutionary fervor that had brought the party to power. The Cultural Revolution's primary goal was to reassert Mao's authority and eradicate what he called the Four Olds: old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits. Mao called on the youth of China to act as the vanguard of this movement, urging them to bombard the headquarters and challenge established authority. In response, millions of young people, organized into groups known as Red Guards, took to the streets to carry out Mao's directives. The Red Guards were instrumental in the early stages of the Cultural Revolution. Fueled by revolutionary zeal, they targeted teachers, intellectuals, and government officials accused of harboring counter-revolutionary tendencies. Schools and universities were shut down, and cultural relics, books, and artifacts were destroyed in an effort to cleanse society of its feudal and capitalist past. Public denunciations, humiliation, and violence became commonplace, as individuals were forced to confess their crimes and pledge loyalty to Mao's vision. Chaos and factionalism. The Cultural Revolution quickly spiraled into chaos. As Red Guard factions began to compete for influence and control, the movement became increasingly fragmented. Local rivalries and ideological differences led to violent clashes, turning cities and villages into battlegrounds. In some cases, rival factions within the CPC itself fueled the turmoil, using the Cultural Revolution as an opportunity to settle scores and consolidate power. The disruption extended to all levels of society. Factories, farms, and government institutions were paralyzed as workers and officials were drawn into the conflict. The economy suffered, and daily life became unpredictable and unstable. The CPC's centralized authority weakened, as Mao's directives often bypassed traditional channels of governance, creating a vacuum of leadership in many regions. Amid the chaos, Mao maintained his grip on the movement by cultivating a cult of personality. His image and quotations from the Little Red Book became ubiquitous, serving as symbols of revolutionary purity. Mao's charismatic appeal and the fervor of his followers helped sustain the Cultural Revolution, even as its consequences grew increasingly destructive. The Down to the Countryside movement. By 1968, Mao recognized the need to regain control over the movement he had unleashed. In an effort to restore order, he initiated the Down to the Countryside movement, which called for millions of urban youths, primarily Red Guards, to be sent to rural areas for re-education through manual labor. Officially presented as a way to bridge the gap between urban and rural China, the movement also served to disperse the Red Guards and reduce the unrest in cities. For the young people sent to the countryside, the experience was often harsh and disillusioning. Many struggled to adapt to the physical demands of agricultural work and the isolation of rural life. The movement disrupted families, education, and career paths, leaving a generation of Chinese youth deeply affected by the upheaval. The role of the Gang of Four. During the later years of the Cultural Revolution, Mao increasingly relied on a group of loyalists known as the Gang of Four to enforce his policies and maintain ideological purity. The Gang of Four, led by Mao's wife Jiang Qing, played a central role in shaping the movement's cultural and political agenda. They spearheaded campaigns to promote revolutionary art and literature, while suppressing dissent and targeting perceived enemies within the party and society. The Gang of Four's influence grew as the Cultural Revolution progressed, but their radicalism and divisive tactics alienated many within the CPC. After Mao's death in 1976, their role in the excesses of the Cultural Revolution would become a focal point of criticism, ultimately leading to their arrest and trial. The human and social costs. The Cultural Revolution had devastating consequences for China. Estimates of the death toll vary, but scholars generally agree that hundreds of thousands and possibly millions of people lost their lives as a result of violence, persecution, and imprisonment. Countless more were displaced, impoverished, or subjected to psychological trauma. The disruption to education, industry, and agriculture left long-lasting scars on the nation's economy and social fabric. Cultural heritage also suffered irreparable damage. Temples, historical sites, and works of art were destroyed or defaced in the name of revolution. The intellectual and cultural elite of China were decimated, with many scholars, artists, and writers silenced or exiled. Mao's final years. As the Cultural Revolution wound down in the early 1970s, Mao's health began to decline. He suffered from a range of ailments, including heart and lung conditions, and his physical and mental faculties deteriorated in his later years. Despite his waning health, Mao remained the paramount leader of China, and his influence within the CPC continued to shape the nation's direction. One of the most significant developments during Mao's final years was the rapprochement between China and the United States. In 1972, Mao met with U.S. President Richard Nixon during a historic visit to Beijing. This meeting marked a dramatic shift in China's foreign policy, as the PRC sought to counterbalance its deteriorating relationship with the Soviet Union by engaging with the West. The normalization of Sino-American relations laid the groundwork for China's eventual integration into the global economy. Mao's death and legacy. Mao Zedong died on September 9, 1976, at the age of 82. His death marked the end of an era in Chinese history, as the nation grappled with the legacy of his leadership. Mao's body was embalmed and placed in a mausoleum in Tiananmen Square, where it remains a site of pilgrimage and reflection. Mao's legacy is one of profound complexity. To many, he is remembered as a visionary leader who united China, ended foreign domination, and laid the foundation for its modernization. His policies on land reform, education, and industrialization transformed the nation and improved the lives of millions. However, his rule was also marked by immense human suffering, particularly during the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, which left deep scars on Chinese society. In the years following Mao's death, China embarked on a path of reform and opening under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping, moving away from Mao's radical policies and embracing economic pragmatism. Yet Mao's image and ideology remain central to the Chinese Communist Party's narrative, reflecting both the achievements and contradictions of his revolutionary legacy. Conclusion: the dual legacy of Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong's legacy remains one of the most contentious and polarizing in modern history. As the founder of the People's Republic of China, he is credited with unifying a fragmented nation, expelling foreign domination, and laying the groundwork for China's transformation into a global power. Under his leadership, land reform and public health campaigns improved the lives of millions, and his emphasis on mass mobilization fostered a sense of national unity and pride. Mao's determination to adapt Marxist principles to China's unique conditions also created an enduring ideological framework, Maoism, that continues to influence leftist movements worldwide. However, the darker side of Mao's rule casts a long shadow. The Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, marked by devastating famine, violence, and social upheaval, resulted in tens of millions of deaths and irreparable damage to China's cultural and intellectual heritage. Mao's policies, often driven by ideology over pragmatism, disrupted economic progress and inflicted immense suffering on the Chinese people. His insistence on maintaining absolute authority led to purges, political repression, and a climate of fear within the Communist Party and society at large. Today, Mao's evaluation is deeply nuanced. In China, the Communist Party officially acknowledges his contributions while admitting the serious mistakes of his later years, often framing him as a figure who was 70% right and 30% wrong. For many Chinese, Mao remains a symbol of national independence and resilience, even as the country has embraced market-oriented reforms that diverge from his vision of socialism. Internationally, opinions on Mao vary widely, with some viewing him as a revolutionary hero and others as one of history's most destructive autocrats. Ultimately, Mao Zedong's legacy encapsulates the complexities of revolutionary leadership and the challenges of transforming a vast, diverse society. His achievements in unifying and modernizing China cannot be ignored, but neither can the catastrophic consequences of his policies. Mao remains a towering and paradoxical figure, a leader whose ambition reshaped China for better and for worse. His life and legacy continue to spark debate, offering lessons on the potential and perils of revolutionary change.